Good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Colin Weil, and I am the Executive Director of B'nai Jeshurun. Welcome. But I'm wearing two kippah tonight. I get to bring together my vocation and my avocation through this collaboration between two great stalwart Jewish institutions, BJ and Yale. Now, some may question the description of Yale as a Jewish place. Indeed, only half a century ago did the admissions quotas finally fade away. But even well before that, Yale chose to add to its crest the Hebrew phrase Urim v'Tumim, complementing the Latin Lux e Veritas, light and truth. Urim v'Tumim doesn't really translate, but it describes a pair of objects which in ancient times were thought to reveal the will of God, sort of an ancient magic 8-ball as I understand it. Combine this with Yale's mission to forge leaders of church and state through dissemination of deep knowledge, critical thinking skills, and through lots of close reading of texts. Sounds pretty Talmudic to me. This makes my role as co-founder and co-chair of the Yale Jewish Alumni Association pretty gratifying. Our mission is simple: to strengthen the Yale Jewish community by creating connection and enabling lifelong learning and service. And so tonight is a beautiful expression of those missions, convening a conversation between two exemplary Jewish alumni who seek to bring light and truth to the world as they deeply engage in the public sector. How fitting also to present tonight's conversation here at BJ in the context of faith and public life, American democracy, Jewish responsibility, our year-long exploration of the role of faith in public life and social movements, and on how we can answer the Jewish call to work towards a just and redeemed world. Someone in the room tonight might have helped write another way to say that: to forge a path towards a more perfect union. I am so pleased to present David Litt and Robin Pogrebin in conversation, Words and Politics in America Today. David first joined the BJ community in diapers, as he shared with me tonight, when his parents, Sarah and Andy, joined in the late 80s. Upon graduation from Yale in 2008, David hit the campaign trail for then Senator Obama, and by 2011 had successfully written his way into the White House, eventually as a special assistant to the president and senior presidential speechwriter. Described as the comic muse for the president, David was the lead writer on 4 White House Correspondents' Dinner Monologues. After getting to be a recurring character in what is surely a seminal story of our times, David had the stamina and the discipline to write it all down in the best-selling Thanks Obama, My Hopey, Changey White House Years. Copies will be for sale in the back of the room after the talk, and David will be autographing books. David is currently the head writer of Funny or Die in the Washington, D.C. office. Robin Pogrebin cut her reporting chops at the Yale Daily News in the mid-1980s and hasn't stopped investigating and reporting the news. After stints at the New York Observer and on Peter Jennings' ABC News documentary unit, Robin joined the New York Times, where she currently reports on the worlds of art, architecture, and culture, focusing on the institutions, the creators and the makers, the professionals and the patrons who together weave the vibrant tapestry of today's American culture. And Robin's parents, Bert and Letty, are here in the audience today, I believe, and they're also long-term BJ members. So it is my deep pleasure to welcome David and Robin to the stage.
Thank you for welcoming us, and it's great to be here with you, David. Not only do we share a Yale background, but he went to Dalton, where my twin sister went and her kids, and my parents are hardcore BJ members. And you know, David was just asking me how I came to moderate this, and you know, basically I had just happened to read his book, which I loved, and so I actually volunteered when they were looking for a moderator. I believe I asked my sister first, and I was the second choice. Happy to pinch hit. And when I read the book, I actually listened to the book, which I would recommend to a lot of you, which is fun because David reads it, and he's funny, and so it's very entertaining to listen to, and he even sings at certain points, and maybe we'll get around to some of that. But I think it would be nice, David, to start with, is the sound okay, guys? A little echoey. What's that, Abby? A little louder. To start with, just to the degree to which, since we're here in this sanctuary and you have a connection to BJ, just whether or not you're connection to this place influenced the book at all or informed it? And also I thought it was interesting to hear that that was part of your brief, was not only were you the funny guy and you dealt with some other issues on a regular basis, but you had Jewish issues as sort of part of your portfolio. So talk about that.
Sure, and thank you for volunteering to do this. And when I asked you how you ended up doing it, I wasn't expecting you to say it was because I read your book and I just really liked it, but I'm glad that that was the answer. And it is, talking about sort of Dalton and B'nai Jeshurun, and then, it's kind of like an Upper West Side, this is your life for me. And so I see a lot of family and family friends here, and thank you for coming. And when I heard Colin say that I had said that I joined BJ in diapers, and I should make it clear I was a child at the time. So I did grow up going to B'nai Jeshurun, and I think there's kind of two things. I wouldn't say that this is sort of a book where if I had gone to a different synagogue, who knows how my life might have turned out. I wouldn't go quite that far. But I would say that one of the things that this place does and values that is not so common in a religious institution is holding simultaneously the ability to question and the importance of questioning and the importance of skepticism and even a little doubt, and not as the sort of enemy of faith, but as something that's compatible and even necessary to faith. And I do think that in the sort of roundabout way, this book ended up being about what it means to believe in something, and what it means to believe in something and then how to also have doubts about it and how to do those things at the same time. So I do think that that is something that I got out of here. More practically, when I had come to the White House it was 2011, and the chief speechwriter at the time, a guy named John Favreau, who I'm sure many of you know from Pod Save America, the podcast that he hosts now, he said, well, President Obama is speaking to the Union for Reform Judaism. I think 5,000 people from across the country are coming for their summit. Who's going to write that speech? And I remember thinking, well, I had gone to like 8 years of Hebrew school, and I always wondered why, and then sort of had this moment of like, oh, this is why. And so I didn't end up writing the foreign policy side of, when it sort of came to the Iran deal or a lot of other big issues in the Jewish community. I got to avoid that stuff and focus more on the speeches and some of the videos, the addresses that were specifically targeted at the American Jewish community. And that was something that was, I think every speechwriter, you had the things that all the sorts of things you love doing, but every so often the president's schedule and your own personal background and life would intersect. And I think those were always fun, regardless of where people came from, kind of how, in the same way that I think the Irish speechwriters looked forward to St. Patrick's Day for the same reason.
I actually was able to attend the Hanukkah party at the White House one year. Did you always go, and was that a highlight?
I did. No, those were nightmares. I have to be careful. The Hanukkah party, well, the thing that was really difficult was that the Hanukkah party was so popular, and it's just such a pain to figure out who to invite and not invite. I didn't have to do any of that, thank goodness. And the people who did really did heroic work. But we ended up having two of them. Other White Houses had only had one, and we would have two back to back on the same night. And so you'd have to write two different speeches about the same subject on the same day. And there's not that much, especially by year 7 or year 8, that you can say about Hanukkah that you haven't said in 3 minutes or less. So I think we may have recycled the joke, the speech that was supposed to last one party lasted for 2 parties or something like that.
I think Trump might have skipped that this year. Did he have a Hanukkah party?
Certainly in spirit, if not in person. I don't know. No, he didn't. He actually didn't skip it. It was interesting. It was one of those moments where I think he went, and the only thing I remember about what he said was he just sort of stopped whatever he was saying and just said Jerusalem very loudly. And he has that way of sort of deciding what he thinks. It's just such a different way of thinking and such a different kind of institutional way of going about it, where instead of trying to do something that deals with an issue and not sound like you're pandering, it's sort of like, what's the key pander? And I'm just going to say that very loudly. And that ends up being, and he does that with a lot of different audiences. He'll just kind of pick the word that he's like, all right, here's what I want you to focus, kind of beat you over the head with it.
Say it many times.
Yeah, say it, or just once at a very high volume, all caps.
When you talk about belief, which, just sort of segue from synagogue, you really were a believer. And I think in the climate we're living in now, in terms of this presidency, it's sort of, you can be nostalgic for a time when you could really become sort of evangelical about a leader. And can you talk about sort of the moment when you sort of fell hard for Obama on the plane and how and why that happened?
Yeah, I was, I think, probably like a lot of people who grow up around here, I was not super political, but I think I sort of followed current events the way that other people might follow sports. I think it was sort of a family thing. And I had volunteered on the John Kerry campaign a little bit. And the way I put it in the book was that what made me feel, to use an overused word, disillusioned about that moment was not that we lost, it was sort of how John Kerry went about campaigning. It was like he was trying to spend 6 months straight arguing that the most talented Beatle was Ringo. His heart wasn't in it. And in 2008, when I was graduating, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I had applied to join the CIA, figuring that, I directed an improv comedy troupe, so I'm probably the guy to get bin Laden. They disagreed with that. And then I was kind of casting about looking for something to do, and I think it's one of the reasons why my experience discovering Obama in that way felt almost religious. I was on a plane, like you said, flying back into JFK, and I was on JetBlue, where they give you the free TV
Cable.
on the plane. Free cable is an important part of the story. And I was flipping between channels, and I saw this Barack Obama guy giving a speech, and it was the night of the Iowa caucuses, and he had just won, and he was delivering his victory speech. And there are so few moments when you can look back and say, this 10-minute period changed my life, and almost all of them are bad. And this is a rare good one. I mean, this was a moment when, by the time that plane landed, I was just a fundamentally different person than I was when I started watching that speech. I, became one of those people who would not shut up about Barack Obama, and now, a decade later, literally, here we are. So it really was almost a religious conversion. I think you even remember
some of those words that he said.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the most important part of that speech was when he looked at the organizers in the room, and a lot of them I was lucky enough to work with and become friends with when I got to the White House, and he said, faced with impossible odds, people who love this country can change it. And I mean, it's funny now to think about how pessimistic we were during the George W. Bush years, but it did feel like we were facing these impossibly long odds as a country. And this also felt like the first time where somebody said, not only am I exceptional, which you can figure out within 2 seconds of seeing Barack Obama give a speech, but I need your help. And it was the first time, not just in my life, but when I got to work with volunteers, I found people who said the last time I volunteered for a campaign was McGovern, or and this was the first time someone asked me to help. And I feel like that's the moment that I said, okay, he's talking to me.
Before we get into the Obama years, can you just kind of recount for us why you didn't make the CIA cut?
Sure. Well, I didn't make the CIA cut. So I applied, and I got a call from the CIA, or from someone in the CIA, and he sounded very friendly, and he said, all right, well, let's just get this out of the way. Have you used any illegal substances in the last 12 months? And I thought about lying to the CIA, and maybe that's what they were hoping I would do. I mean, it's quite possible that this was my test. And if I had lied, we'd be having a very different conversation right now. But instead, I told them the truth, which was that I had smoked pot a month before, which was my 21st birthday. And immediately my interviewer said, well, that's it, interview over. There's a new rule that says if you've used any illegal substances within a calendar year, we can't even consider you for a job. So for all I know, they left being like, that guy directed an improv comedy troupe. We really did need him to get bin Laden, and they were as disappointed as I was. But somehow I doubt it.
So, I mean, one of the wonderful things about this book I found is that whole sense of what would be like to work in the White House, what it would be like to encounter this president in any kind of regular way is very much conveyed by your experience. And so take us from the plane to actually getting a job.
Sure. Well, one of the things that I thought felt important to me when I was working on this book was that when I was in college, we'd do master's teas or whatever they call them now, but people who were successful would come tell you about how successful they were, and then they would tell you to do exactly what they did, and you would become successful. And I felt like that just seemed, even in the short experience that I had being a real human out of college in the world, seemed so it seemed so odd to look backwards rather than to think about how it actually feels in that moment. So I wanted to write about how I was quite possibly the worst intern in Washington for the semester when I got to DC. I had an internship at a crisis communications firm, and for a variety of reasons, I decided I needed to go rogue as an intern, which lots of DC interns imagine doing, but no DC intern actually does. And so I decided to stop obeying the dress code, and then I moved my office into the break room. I took my laptop and gave up my cubicle, and I would just sit in the break room all day working. And I did that so that my back would be to the wall so that no one would notice that I was playing Minesweeper as they walked by.
Maybe you better tell some people what Minesweeper is.
So Minesweeper is a free game you get on a PC computer. It's one of the two free, it goes with Solitaire, and I got very good at it. And then I started only answering work questions and analogies to the game of Minesweeper I was playing at the time. Like somebody would ask, when's that memo going to be ready? And I would say, well, pretty soon, but it's like when you're playing Minesweeper and you have 5 mines left and only 7 squares, so any square could be a mine, so the hard part is really at the end, so that memo may be a while. And I thought I was getting away with this, which I was not, and I almost got fired as an intern. And then a couple years later, I ended up at the White House, so that's strange. And I did want to sort of talk a little bit about the role that luck plays. I mean, I ended up at the White House because I had a friend from Yale. His brother was a speechwriter for John Kerry in the Senate. I had coffee with him back when I was having coffee with anyone who would have coffee with me. And he said, well, would you like to do this blog post over the weekend? We had an intern work on it. It didn't go great. And I did that. They liked it. And he helped me get a job at a speechwriting firm called West Wing Writers, which, if anyone here is interested in speechwriting, is a great firm. And then a couple years after that, Valerie Jarrett, who was the president's senior advisor, needed someone to write speeches for her and for the other senior staff. And they basically said, you could go to Chicago and work on the re-elect, but if you'd rather, you could just stay here and work at the White House. And I was like, yeah, okay, I could do that. And so that's how I ended up there.
And describe your Valerie Jarrett interview and what you were asked to do on the spot.
Well, so speechwriting interviews tend to be a little bit like if you're interviewing for a TV writing job or another kind of writing job in that way. You take a prompt, so somebody says, I think when I applied at the speechwriting firm I worked for, they said, Leonardo DiCaprio is speaking about the environment at Dartmouth College, write 2,000 words for him. And you take a week and you write your speech and you submit it, and it's blind, so no one can see who did what. And then they pick which speeches they like, and then maybe you get a formal interview. So I went in expecting something kind of like that. I went through some of my questions, my greatest strength, my greatest weakness, which was also my greatest strength, whatever. And then Mike Strautmanis, who was Valerie Jarrett's chief of staff, said, okay, well, I got a meeting. Valerie has a speech coming up next week to the business roundtable. Why don't you write that, and then I'll come back and take a look at it when I'm done. And then he left. And so it was, and I don't know whether he had never interviewed a speechwriter before, so I don't know whether he just didn't know how it was done, or whether he felt like this is a better predictor of whether you can succeed in the White House than whether you can write a good speech. It's just kind of, can you do something in way less time than you think you need, with a lot of pressure for no particular reason? And if you can do that, you'll be all right. And so I just sat down and kind of MacGyvered a speech together, and then figured, okay, well, at least I did that, and then hopefully I'll get called back for an interview. And Straught said, you know what, let's see if Valerie's free right now. Let's go over to the West Wing and check it out. And I'd never been in the West Wing, so I was totally terrified. But so we went in, and 10 minutes later, he said, well, you know, what starting salary are you looking at? And I was like, wait a second, I think I just got a job at the White House. And so that's my, you know, I talked to friends who go through like 5 rounds of job interviews, and I'm like, that sounds much scarier.
What did you do when you got home and realized you had a job?
You know, I yelled a lot of obscenities, jumping up and down in my underwear. I did what I think anyone would do, but not necessarily anyone would write that they had done. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And so and then I started calling everybody, and then I immediately stopped because the hard part about getting a White House job for me was, you know, kind of by luck I stumbled into the job. But then you have the 1 month of pure agony as people go through, and the FBI interviews everyone you've ever met. They're checking to see if you've lied to anybody or there's any inconsistencies. You know, they're calling family, they're calling your friends. And a random day, you get invited to the Interior Department to take a drug test. You know, all sorts of different things, and you start to imagine, you know, it had been quite some time since I would have not been allowed to join the CIA, but still you start to think, well, who knows, what if I randomly fail a drug test? Wasn't there that episode of Seinfeld about that, or whatever? And so
the FBI interviewed your parents, didn't they?
They did, yeah. I think they have an agent who is like responsible for interviewing Jewish parents and being like, okay, enough, stop bragging and tell me if he's a criminal, that sort of thing.
So take us from Valerie Jarrett to Obama. How do you get there?
So I was lucky enough. When I was at the White House, I ended up being, I was Valerie Jarrett's speechwriter, and then the rest of the senior staff was told I was the senior staff speechwriter. And then the White House, the president's speechwriting staff said, well, you're mostly the senior staff speechwriter, but you can pinch hit whenever you're free. And so I got to sit in on those meetings. And actually, that speech to the Union for Reform Judaism, or Union of Reform Judaism, that was probably one of the biggest speeches that I did early on. So you kind of wait for, you know, the right opportunity. Actually, in commencements, Valerie always used to say, put yourself in the path of lightning. Kind of just show up somewhere where stuff is going on and there's not enough people to do it, and something good will happen. And that's what happened in my case too. And between, you know, the Hebrew school and also being able to write jokes, there were just enough opportunities that I started pinch hitting more and more often for the president.
So describe your first meeting with Obama and how that went.
So the first time I met President Obama this was Thanksgiving 2011, and I was assigned to write the Thanksgiving Day video address, which is not an important speech, but I thought was the most important speech Barack Obama would ever give. And so I spent a week on this thing. I mean, I wrote and I rewrote. It was maybe 500 words, and it was about Thanksgiving, so it's not like there's that many options of things to say about Thanksgiving. But I was sure I had nailed it. And I went to the diplomatic room, which is the room in the White House where we were filming the speech. And it's this wraparound mural of American life from the 1800s. And I was waiting and waiting and waiting. And finally, somebody gets an email on their BlackBerry, and they say, okay, he's moving. And then 30 seconds later, President Obama walks into the room. And he's standing up, so we all stand up. And he sits down, so we all sit down. And he was about to start filming when the woman behind the camera, Hope Hall, the videographer, stopped the president and said, actually, Mr. President, this is David. This is the first video he's ever written for you. And President Obama looked at me. And he said, oh, how's it going, David? And I had exactly one thought in that moment, which was, I did not realize we were going to have to answer questions. And I have literally no idea what I said after that. I actually blacked out. And I discovered later this was a fairly common occurrence upon first meeting President Obama. I talked to a lot of people who sort of, you know, gradually you'd be talking about this and you'd be like, oh, you blacked out too, didn't you? And like, yeah, I did. And so, yeah, I don't know what happened after that, but I guess it wasn't that bad.
And is this the Thanksgiving speech that then ended up being problematic?
Well, it did, because I neglected God in the speech. So I had thought about almost everything, but I'd never used the word God anywhere in there. And The Daily Show actually ended up doing a whole thing about this because George W. Bush also left God out a whole bunch. Fox News, for some reason, didn't care about that. But when Obama did it, it mattered a lot. And so, somewhere between like carving the turkey and sitting down for dessert, this thing had gone from the proudest moment of my life to being like a miniature scandal. And it was all over the conservative press, and it was this really weird moment when I first realized what it means to write speeches for a president, which in addition to, you want to do a good job, you want to write words that have an impact, etc. It also means there's a group of people whose full-time job is to take whatever the president says out of context and just use it to create a controversy, whether there's a controversy or not. And so it was very strange to see my very unimportant Thanksgiving video suddenly become, I think someone called a proof that Obama was a militant atheist. I was like, no, it was proof that the speechwriter forgot the thing. But somehow that doesn't end up being the story.
So the takeaway was you need to write defensively to some extent. And
Yeah.
you learned that for the future, to sort of think about proactively making sure people weren't going to be able to poke holes.
Yeah, I think that's the hardest thing about writing speeches in general, and certainly speeches for someone as scrutinized as an American president. And I feel like everything I say about this has the sort of like until now caveat, so that just applies to all of it. But what I mean by that is that writing defensively is never a good idea. It's never good writing. But then at the same time, you have to do that in order to be writing something that helps advance an agenda in the way you want. And so the ability to both write well and write defensively and do it all in a very short amount of time, I think that's the difference between people who are really good speechwriters and people who do really well as presidential speechwriters or in an environment as pressure-packed as the White House.
And given that Obama is sort of perhaps the most articulate president we've ever had, and certainly just has an eloquence and a great delivery, I mean, was there sort of an exponential sort of level of pressure in terms of writing for him? I imagine he was quite an editor. I mean, can you talk about like whether or not that was intimidating on a different level because of his intellect?
Yeah, I think what was really unique about writing for President Obama is that he is the only president, I really think, since Lincoln who was a writer first before he became a president. And that in some ways was great. I mean, I have a lot of friends who are terrific speechwriters in Washington, and they know that no matter how good their work is, their principal, the person doing the speaking, is going to make them sound worse than they are. And we had the opposite problem. I mean, we wrote for somebody who understood good writing when he saw it, and when he made edits, you, on one hand, felt like a little disappointed, but on the other hand, you were like, this is great, because this is going to be the part of the speech where people say, hey, did you write that? And I'm like, well, it was in the speech. And that's very rare for speechwriters. We were really lucky in that way. But it was also scary because you knew that if there was something in there that didn't belong, he was going to catch it.
So, you become sort of one of the funny guys, if not the funny guy, in the end. And were you comfortable with that role, or did you feel like I should be, writing about, international policy, world crises, a mass shooting? Were you okay with the role you ended up?
The equivalent of like I need a sort of a dramatic role. No, I think so. I ended up being the token funny person at the White House kind of by default. So John Lovett, who is another one of the Pod Save America hosts now, and left the White House in 2011, and he had been writing the jokes. And I had interned at The Onion and had what in DC passed for a comedy background, and so basically by just the process of elimination, I was the one doing the jokes for President Obama, or kind of leading that process when he would do them. The nice thing was I got to do that about 1 month out of the year, and then the rest of the year was spent mostly doing serious stuff. There was 1 year where I was doing a speech for the Correspondents' Dinner, so jokes, and I was working on that, and then simultaneously also had to do a speech when President Obama spoke to the Shoah Foundation, Steven Spielberg's foundation, which is about as far from 20 minutes of jokes as you can get. And so in the sitcom version of my life, I would have mixed up the speeches or something. But realistically, I just ended up, having to switch very quickly from being the joke person to being the serious speechwriter.
And in the book, you talk about how, in addition to him sort of making your words better, he had a real sense of humor and a great sense of timing and made your jokes even better. So talk about that process of the joke writing, which was fascinating to me in terms of how many contributions you're getting initially and how you're culling the best.
Joke writing was different than writing regular speeches in the White House because generally speaking, a speech about, let's say, infrastructure policy, one speechwriter would have the pen on that speech, and they would work with the chief speechwriter, and then that would go to the president and some policy people, and that would be it. Joke writing, we had about 12 people contributing jokes for any given speech. So
didn't people like come over the transom though too? Like, didn't you have like random Saturday Night Live people?
Oh, sure.
And
yeah, I mean, one of the great things, I mean, probably outside of the chance to, serve the American people and all of that, I do think that one of the best things about the White House is that you can call anybody. I mean, when I was like 24, I could call pretty much anyone in the country and they would call me back. It was pretty great. I missed that. And as a comedy nerd, I could call up people, comedy writers or comedians who I really admired and say, hey, do you want to write some jokes for the president? And 9 times out of 10, they'd be like, yeah, thank you. And I'd be like, oh, you're welcome. And so it was really fun to get to work with people some who were in politics mostly, but also some people who were full-time professional comedy writers. And the secret to coming up with maybe 30 jokes for a speech like that was to come up with about 600 beforehand. And then we would cut that down to 40, 45. That would go to the president in the Oval Office, and then he would go through them and say like, wow, that's pretty good, or, I don't really get that one. And we'd take notes and have a series of panic attacks. And once that was over, I would then go back and revise and tinker. But the main way we got that many good jokes written was just to write a lot of other jokes too. I mean, I'd probably write 300 a year, knowing that the vast majority of them I would never want to see the light of day.
And describe sort of being in the Oval Office with him, going over these jokes. I mean, one of the things you say is that the only way to tell if they worked was to have him, say them.
Yeah, that was another difference, I think, between comedy speeches and serious speeches. By a couple of years into his presidency, President Obama did not need to practice his remarks in front of a mirror. He knew what he was doing. But I do think jokes are an exception with something like that because the words need to be so precise and the emphasis needs to be so precise that you do need to go over it a couple of times. And you need to figure out, does this line not just work in general, but does it work when Barack Obama is the one saying it? So sometimes things that you thought would be really funny didn't really land, and sometimes things you kind of stuck in there because you needed some filler turned out to be great. And I think the other way we were really helped by this is that President Obama, just as a person, is a funny person with a sense of humor. I mean, that's not universal for politicians, and so he enjoyed doing stuff like that.
So talk about, let's say, a couple of jokes that didn't make it in, or that we were disappointed by, or that you understood why they didn't, but you had been invested in them.
Well, one of the things that I always found about writing speeches is you have to be fully invested in what you write because you're a writer, and I think any writer needs to own their work, and then you need to be equally willing to say, never mind, it's not mine. If it doesn't work for the person doing the speaking, I'll give it up. And that's harder with jokes, but probably more important. I mean, I had a joke.
What about the Sarah Palin one?
Well, so that was a joke that went well. So I wrote a joke. That's a good point, actually. I think one of the things that surprised me was that most of the time, President Obama was the one pushing us to be a little sharper with the jokes.
Edgier.
A little edgier.
Yeah.
Those were kind of the words he used a lot. I talk about one time when we had a joke about Dick Cheney saying President Obama was the worst president of his lifetime. And I think the punchline I wrote was like, and here I thought we were friends, which was kind of a throwaway, like, just a way of getting Dick Cheney's obnoxious comment into a speech. But it wasn't really a good joke. And President Obama crossed out that punchline, and then just for emphasis, he wrote, "It's Cheney!" ! Like, come on, you can do better than that. I think that was, he often pushed us to do stuff like that. With the, I'm also thinking of a joke In 2013, this was a very different time. The election had just ended. The Republicans had just done their autopsy of the results, and their big result was we have to reform immigration and do a better job reaching beyond our base. And the joke was, one thing all Republicans agree on is they need to do a better job reaching out to minorities. Call me self-centered, but I can think of one minority they could start with. And I remember we thought about not bringing that joke to President Obama because he had never referred to himself as a minority before, not in a serious speech and certainly not in a joking way. And we said, well, we might as well try it. And he really liked that one. I mean, you could tell he liked something because he would be like, oh yeah, I'll do a little wave there. You know, something to add something to it. So that's, I think in the actual performance, he added, think of me as a trial run, which I thought was a good line also.
And the Sarah Palin one he embellished.
Yeah, he did. So that's a little bit of more complicated wind-up. So in 2012, and I feel ridiculous saying this, in the beginning of the presidential campaign, 2 dog-related stories were like actually very important. So one was Mitt Romney had driven to Canada and had his dog in a car carrier on the roof of the family car. The Romney people were worried that this story was going to gain traction, so they came up with their counter-dog story, which was that in his autobiography, President Obama talks about being 6 years old and being in Indonesia and eating dog. And so this question of, is it worse to abuse your dog as an adult or ingest a random dog as a child, this was what political reporters were really getting to the bottom of. And so my job was not to kind of pick which controversies were out there, it was just to comment on them. So and while all this was going on, Sarah Palin had guest hosted the Today Show. And so the joke that we wrote was, Sarah Palin's getting back in the game, she's guest hosting the Today Show. That reminds me of an old line. What's the difference between a hockey mom and a pit bull? A pit bull is delicious. And that was another joke we thought about not bringing into the Oval Office, I think for obvious reasons. And
but you did.
Yeah, I think that was his favorite from that year. Not in terms of necessarily which is the funniest, but he just enjoyed that the most. And the moment he heard it, he was like, oh yeah, I'm gonna, say a little soy sauce with that, or that was his kind of way of taking ownership of that one. And then the other thing, if you watch the video of that dinner, there's the president's line, he does the little soy sauce bit, about half of the room is laughing and the other half is turning to the person laughing, being like, what on earth is he talking about? And then they cut to the First Lady who's just like, oh my God. So that was pretty fun.
It's her birthday today, by the way.
Is it?
Yeah.
I think it's also Betty White's birthday.
Oh, nice.
Tons of birthdays.
Talk about the Obama joke, the Osama bin Laden joke, why that didn't work.
Well, so this was 2011. I had just started at the White House, and I wasn't like the person responsible for the Correspondents' Dinner that year. The way I always thought about it was, for most of the time I was there, if things went badly, it would be my fault. It was a team effort, but if there was blame to go around, it was my responsibility. That year, I was just pitching jokes, and John Lovett and John Favreau, who were still there, were kind of running the process for the dinner. And I had about 4 jokes in a draft of the speech. And the one I was really proud of was about all the conspiracy theories going around about the president and his middle name, and the joke was, Tim Pawlenty sounds all American, but have you heard his real middle name? It's Tim Bin Laden Pawlenty. And I thought this was very edgy and very sharp and was going to be a big deal. And I didn't go into the Oval Office meeting with the president because I was the new guy. All I saw was that when the joke came back, the final version had Bin Laden taken out, and it said Tim Hosni Pawlenty, after Hosni Mubarak from the Egyptian strongman who got deposed in the Arab Spring. And I remember thinking, well, this is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, I've been here 4 weeks, but this time the White House needs my input desperately. And so I started to write out this kind of joke manifesto on my BlackBerry. And by this point, even just a month in, I was very good at typing long BlackBerry messages. And I was about to hit send when I sort of heard this kind of bureaucratic angel on my shoulder just say, stay in your lane. And so I didn't hit send on the email. And then the president told that joke. And then the next day I was coming home. I was at a music festival with some friends, and we were in the car coming home, and I got an email, it was another draft, and it just said, final remarks on the death of UBL. And I had no idea what UBL meant. And then it said, below that, or the subject line said UBL, and the remark said on the death of Osama bin Laden. And I thought, okay, I'm very glad I did not hit send on that email.
One of your triumphs was the Luther the Anger Translator. Can you talk about how you helped make that happen, and also explain for people who may not know who that is?
Yeah, so Luther the Anger Translator is a character that Keegan-Michael Key played on his sketch show on Comedy Central, which is Key and Peele. And the premise of the show, or the premise of the sketch, was that Jordan Peele would impersonate the president, and then Keegan would play Luther the Anger Translator, basically just complaining about all the nonsense that America was putting him through, as angry as we all assumed that President Obama was secretly. And for reasons that may not surprise you, President Obama was a big fan of this character. And we had always thought about, is there the right time to get them together on stage? And it was never right. I mean, in 2012, we did not want to imply that Barack Obama was secretly an angry black man, even as a joke. That didn't seem like a smart idea. In 2013, there had just been the bombing at the Boston Marathon. In 2014, there was the healthcare debacle, and so we weren't really in a strutting type of mood. And then in 2015, everything kind of lined up. And so we brought Keegan in, and I had met him at a holiday party, so I had his email, and he was able to make it. And I talk about rehearsing with Keegan as Luther and President Obama, and the hard thing was that President Obama just could not stop laughing the entire time. The moment Keegan would open his mouth, President Obama would just lose it. And I mean, I remember he said to him, he's like, I can get angry, I really do get angry. That part's not hard, but like, I'm just gonna have to hold it together. And honestly, I mean, I do not consider it, among the top Obama administration accomplishments that President Obama kept a straight face during this sketch, but it was still pretty impressive. And if you watch the video of it, you can see he tilts his head toward the anger translator, but then he keeps with his eyes, he'll kind of just dart his peripheral vision out of the way so that he's never fully making eye contact. So he came in there with a strategy.
I recommend that video. It is fun to watch.
Yeah,
you can still see it.
One of the things that I only thought about after this was how much of the book, and therefore how many of the kind of defining experiences for me at the White House.
You can Google them.
You can Google, and also involved in one way or another President Obama laughing. And I thought it was just, there's lots of things that were sort of inadvertent contrasts with President Trump or whatnot, but that I think ended up being, to me, one of the strongest, was just how, I don't think either people who have read this book or will read it learn something shockingly new about Barack Obama. It's not like, oh, he was from Kenya or something crazy. But I do think that there's, in as much as there's kind of things people hadn't seen before, that idea of a president who is that comfortable laughing either at themselves or just in general feels very different now.
What also feels different is just we have a president now who kind of circumvents the whole speechwriting system in a lot of ways and is often speaking off the cuff and has kind of gone rogue in a very consistent way. Do you feel as if that will have lasting change in terms of speechwriting as an art and as a business that matters in the White House?
I think there are definitely going to be some lasting changes, but I think what's been interesting to see about President Trump is when he started, I think the plan was, let's get him out there, let's do as many rallies as we can. There was this sense that at least the Trump camp had, that what was happening on the campaign had worked for them and they wanted to keep it going. And that he was a great communicator, and people said it, I think not just to flatter him, but also because they really meant it. And now he doesn't do a lot of talking. I mean, it's not just that he doesn't do a lot of speaking off a teleprompter or off the cuff. It's that he's almost, retreated pretty dramatically from public view compared to past presidents of both parties. And that's totally bucking the trend. I mean, Bill Clinton spoke more than George H.W. Bush. George W. Bush spoke more than Bill Clinton. Obama spoke more than Bush. So, and I think the question will be in the long term whether Trump ends up being surprisingly popular or historically unpopular. Right now he's historically unpopular, so I don't think people are going to say, oh great, we're going to do what he did. But that could change. And I also think, to me, a counter argument to that is that if you looked at Oprah's speech from the Golden Globes, in some ways it was, it had the structure of an Obama speech. It was very clearly written and read and performed, not in a bad way, but just as a stylistic thing. No one would say, oh, she's telling it like it is. She clearly put some thought into that. And the response to that makes me think that in the same way that people appreciated that Obama was kind of running against the style, not just the substance of George W. Bush, I think even more so people may actually want to go the other way and want someone who can really deliver a speech after Trump.
I was thinking, like, when he was speaking after Charleston, for example, you are so aware when he's reading, and then when he just sort of, goes off and does his own thing, and it must be very frustrating as a speechwriter, I would imagine.
It was not frustrating for the Obama speechwriters. I think the Biden speechwriters, they had some dark circles under their eyes that, and everybody who I know who worked for and wrote for President or Vice President Biden loved working for him. But there was that moment where you say, okay, this, that part of the speech just isn't happening today. And President Obama didn't do that as much. What was interesting is how often he would go off script and no one would know, actually.
I meant Trump going off.
Oh, Trump going off script. Yeah, well,
which is pretty a regular occurrence.
Oh, and you're wondering if his speechwriters are frustrated by that.
Yeah, do you think that's a job you could possibly enjoy?
I don't think it's a job I could enjoy, but for a lot of different, that's not high on the list of reasons. I think that
Do you know anyone who's doing it for him now?
No, I think they cut the speechwriting office down substantially, and from what I heard, they gave the speechwriters policy roles, not just speechwriting roles, which is also a departure from presidents of both parties. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about the Trump administration as it exists right now, is that you have a chief speechwriter who's also very young, Stephen Miller, who is both kind of holding the torch for the white nationalist wing of the White House, but he's also a very influential policy person, which I think people always assume speechwriters can kind of manipulate a principle or put words in someone's mouth, and that was not true, and I think it's probably truer than it's ever been. The weird thing about Trump, though, is he's actually pretty good at sticking to a prompter if he wants to. It reminds me of exactly what people used to say about Obama, even though it was ludicrous, which is that he is reading off a prompter because he doesn't know what he's saying. And it's one of the many, many things where it's like then you have Trump, who's out golfing 2 days out of 3 and then comes back and reads a speech that he's never written and doesn't really understand from a prompter, and nobody says anything. It is quite frustrating. But I do think it's interesting. He can keep it together when he knows that it's important. I imagine when he does the State of the Union later this month, I don't think we're going to, he's not going to call any country's words I won't repeat, just randomly on stage.
Off the cuff.
Yeah.
I want to go to questions, so please do think about them. Before we do, I thought it would be fun just to hear some of your embarrassing moments, and let's take us to Air Force One, and why don't you tell us that story, which is a great one.
So, this was 2015, so I had flown on Air Force One a fair amount, and I will say, lots of my book is about how parts of the White House are not as great as you might think. I mean, the cafeteria, the Navy mess is pretty great. The cafeteria for everybody else like me, not that special. Air Force One is exactly as amazing as you think, every bit. And so I felt like I was a pretty frequent flyer at this point. I had gone on, a 2 dozen trips, but I had never gone on an overnight trip. And I got asked to write a speech that was in Germany. It was not an important international speech. It was kind of like, it's good to be here. Here's a joke about lederhosen. Here's a joke about pretzels. Thank you, everybody. But it was just, they needed someone to do it, and I thought it would be cool to go on the trip, so I went. And what no one told me about Air Force One is that when you go to sleep on Air Force One, you have to figure out what you're going to wear. So that never occurred to me until it was too late. And our trip director, Luke, said, well, remember to bring a change of clothes, remember to bring sleepwear. And so by that time, it was too late to run out and buy anything. So I had either boxers and a t-shirt or a pair of pajamas I bought my freshman year of college, which were covered in pictures of the Incredible Hulk. So I went with Hulk, and I brought my pajamas, and I also didn't realize there's not like a good system for sleeping. One of the strange things about Air Force One, it is clearly the best plane ever, or at least the best plane people get to fly right now, but then staff sleep on the floor. I mean, those are the good spots. I didn't know that, so I got stuck in one of the seats. And it was cold, and there's track lighting everywhere. So they were handing out sleeping pills, but I didn't take one because I didn't want to be asleep in case there were edits to my lederhosen pretzel speech. And so I got almost no sleep, and then they served us a huge breakfast because every meal they served us on the plane was enormous. And I ate the whole thing because someone had once told me that an army marches on its stomach, and one of the flight attendants. I was like, all right, well, I should take that to heart. And by the time I finished eating, I realized that a line of people had formed to change out of their pajamas and into business clothes. And we were about to land, and the lederhosen pretzel speech was the first thing on the agenda, which meant that if President Obama had last-minute edits, I was going to have to go up to his office on the plane in my Hulk pajamas. So this is the part where I panicked. And I thought about, where can I duck into the room with like the secure computers? That seemed like a bad idea. And finally, I had this flash of insight. I realized I'll just sneak into the coat closet. I can fit in there, and my coat's already in there, my suit and tie, and I'll just quickly change, and then no one will ever be the wiser, and I won't have to wait. And I had started my brilliant plan when Luke, the trip director, went to go get his jacket out of the closet. And of course, the closet faced directly into the cabin, so I was facing all of my colleagues and standing in my underwear with a pair of balled-up Hulk pajamas at my feet. And there's that moment where you sort of think, like, what kind of history am I going to make when you start at the White House, or what kind of legacy will I leave? And for a certain segment of White House employees, I think my legacy is that I was the guy who ended up in his underwear on Air Force One. And I later heard that story was so popular that on other international trips, like much more senior staff would go into the closet and just try to reenact it to see whether they could make it work.
Okay, questions. And let's make sure there are questions, and I think we have a mic. Yes, in the front.
The joke involving John Boehner and the name of the cable television show told at a National Press Club dinner.
So that joke, and I'll retell it. Oh yeah, sorry, I'll repeat the question. So the question was about a joke about John Boehner, and it's funny the sort of way some of these things ended up having kernels of truth in them, because this was about a year or two before he got forced out by his own party. And the joke was, Republicans in Congress are giving John Boehner an even harder time than they're giving me. I guess orange really is the new black. And I love that joke. It's probably my favorite, just in terms of the construction of it. It's my favorite joke that the president told. And that was written by a journalist named Rachel Sklar, who I think kind of knew somebody who knew someone in the White House, and it had just trickled down to us the last day. The president had looked over it, and we almost never made changes to anything after that final run-through. And we got that joke, and I was like, all right, this is the rare occasion when I'm going to say, like, can we please just put this in, because it's clearly so great. And I'm glad we did. It was a really good joke.
Yes.
Hi. At any time during the White House years, did you have writer's block? And if so, how did you deal with it?
The question was about writer's block. And I think one of the real nice things about having a job that is so intense as the one that I used to have is that you almost don't have time for writer's block, particularly with speech writing. I mean, you have deadlines in the same way that you do in journalism, but you also have this fear of, the President of the United States getting up there and having literally nothing to say. And so you just know that that's not an option. And that's different than, say, writing a book, where, like, if I had said, oh, never mind, I can't turn in a book, or I can't turn it in on time, I would have let myself down, but it's not like the entire world would have been like, what on earth just happened here? And so in some ways it was easier to deal with writer's block. And I think in general, the thing that I've always felt about writer's block is that it comes from this feeling that you must secretly be perfect at your job, and you are perfect at your job until you start doing it, and that's probably true of a lot of different jobs. And so for writing, for me, when I did have those moments of saying, how do I even get started, it was about giving myself permission to write something really bad. And I would, say, okay, I'm going to start by just writing a really bad paragraph, and then eventually it's going to be good. And that usually was enough to get you started.
Yes.
Thank you. Did you write any of the material that Barack Obama, I believe it was at a correspondence dinner, when he made fun of Donald Trump? And if so, do you think that led to his running?
You're asking if it's my fault. No, it's not. It's not my fault. This was that dinner from 2011. So I had just started there. So I was, I had sort of watched the drafts come in, and we all knew that someone was going to have to say something about Trump. Lovett and Favreau and some of the other comms people were working on that. And then the last draft I got, I remember thinking like, oh, okay, they're really going for it. And so I just got to watch, which was very fun. And I remember thinking, well, that's it for Donald Trump. We're never going to see that guy again. That was wrong. But I think the idea that that's the reason that he ran for president, because Obama made fun of him, I don't think that really is right. I think more likely to me, and it's weird that psychoanalyzing the president has become literally our national pastime, but I do think, if anything, he was kind of jealous rather than humiliated, because I think he always wanted that attention, especially from the elites who were in the room. And I think watching the president sort of deliver those lines and bask in the, kind of the affection and the admiration and the applause, that's still, I think, Donald Trump's fantasy of being president. I would imagine that he doesn't understand why the job that he's doing doesn't seem like that fun job that Obama had when he made fun of him.
Yes, there was someone in the back. Okay, go ahead.
Could I ask you to speak about the serious side of speech writing for a moment? When celebrities talk or politicians talk, I think people are under the impression that it's them actually saying what they think. And given that speechwriters are in fact writing a lot of what they say, should we take away from it that people only really say what they actually believe and the speechwriters are just doing a better job delivering it? Or should we believe that the speeches in the end don't really matter? Or should we believe that people are being fooled by what these people are saying?
So the way that I describe it is that, to me, a speechwriter is more of a personal trainer and not a puppeteer. So what I mean by that is, I could presumably go to a personal trainer and, they would help me look as good as I can look. But there's certain things like they're never going to make me taller. You know what I mean? That's just not going to happen. And I think that there are a variety of ways that speechwriters can make you the best version of yourself or help you present the best version of yourself to the world. But I don't think that speechwriters, for the most part, can just purely put words in someone's mouth. I think actually the current president, is a pretty good example of that. You can do it once. I think last year's sort of quasi-State of the Union was a good example. I think the convention speech that he delivered was another example. But over enough time, especially with someone like a president of the United States, the truth comes out. You can't hide it for that long. So I think in the end, my experience writing words that other people ended up speaking gave me more confidence in speech writing rather than less. I didn't feel like people were being fooled. I did feel like I was saving more important people time, and I felt like I was ideally writing a speech that was close to what President Obama would have written if he had had time to do it himself, but he didn't, obviously.
Yes.
Working for President Obama seems like the absolute acme of what one would aspire to in terms of working in politics. Do you have any aspirations in the future to go back to politics?
So I just like that this side of the room so far is it your fault and have you peaked? And the answer to this one is maybe yes. I don't have any aspirations to go back to full-time speechwriting for someone because I do think I had the best speechwriting job anyone's going to have for a long time. I think that the reason I got into speechwriting was because I felt like I felt like what Obama said when I first saw him on that plane, people who love this country can change it. That spoke to me. And it turned out that that was the way that I could help. And I think being part of that in some way, changing the country that you love and protecting it when it needs protecting and improving it when it needs improving, that to me feels like a full-time job, even if it's not currently my actual full-time job. I think it's sort of a full-time, part-time job for all of us. And I haven't quite figured out how I personally am going to get more involved in that. But I think it's a question a lot of us are asking. I do regret a little bit. I left the White House before the 2016 elections, and I do regret having this feeling of like, nah, democracy is someone else's problem. I put in my time and someone else will deal with it. And I think we were reminded pretty harshly that that's not how that works.
I wanted to also have you talk about how you were always a believer and you remained enamored of him, but you also had moments where that was tempered. I don't know if you want to go as far as to say disillusionment, but certainly some disappointment. He was a human being and he had flaws.
Yeah, I think to me, I read a lot of White House memoirs, especially when I was, not so much as I was getting ready to write this book, but while I was in DC. And you read a lot about White House books, and a lot of them exist on this kind of continuum where people are either, naive and full of hope, or they're realistic and they're disillusioned and cynical. And I don't think that's really how life works. I mean, I think if you meet anyone who's, I'm now 31, if you meet anyone who's 31 who is every bit as idealistic as they were at 22 with no modifications and no disappointments, that person starts to become a weirdo. I'm sure by, another decade that's going to be even more true. But I don't think that that means that you have to be cynical about it. To me, this is a book about being able to be disillusioned and believe at the same time. And I think that contradiction is what it means to love somebody or something or a country or a person. So much of that is understanding their flaws, but also having that faith.
On that very nice note, let's end. And he will be signing books, and thank you all. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So books are available for sale in the back corner, and David will sign books if you brought them as well. And there's also wine and cookies, so stay and schmooze. And thank you very much.